Having established his dominance in Central Africa, Tippu Tip continued to consolidate his power, using a mixture of military force, political manipulation, and economic exploitation to cement his control over vast territories. This second phase of Tippu Tip's career marks the apex of his brutality, as he expanded his slave trading operations, deepened his exploitation of the Congo's resources, and established himself as a key player in the geopolitical struggles of the region. At the height of his power, Tippu Tip ruled over an empire that stretched from the Indian Ocean coast to the heart of Central Africa, controlling not just trade routes and markets but entire populations. At the height of Tippu Tip's power, his influence extended from the Indian Ocean coast deep into Central Africa, where he controlled vast networks of slave labor, ivory extraction, and commerce. By the late 19th century, he had not only become a key figure in the East African slave trade, but also established himself as a political leader of tremendous importance. His growing wealth and influence allowed him to manipulate regional politics, making alliances with local chiefs, European traders, and even colonial officials. However, this expansion came at an immense human cost. The larger his empire grew, the more brutal his methods became as he systematically stripped entire regions of their resources and subjected countless people to unimaginable suffering. This part explores how Tippu Tip consolidated his power through relentless violence, destruction, and exploitation, along with his ever-deepening involvement in the slave trade. During Tippu Tip's reign, the slave trade had become not just a source of wealth, but the lifeblood of his empire. His operations were finely tuned to maximize the extraction of human labor, which was vital to his domination over the vast regions he controlled. By the time he reached the peak of his influence, Tippu Tip had established a highly efficient system of raids, capture, and transportation that brought thousands of enslaved Africans from the interior to the coastal markets of Zanzibar and beyond. One of the key strategies Tippu Tip employed to tighten his grip on the slave trade was the creation of fortified trading posts deep within the African interior. These outposts acted as collection points for captured slaves and ivory, allowing Tippu Tip to consolidate his control over both commodities while also expanding his reach further into uncharted territories. From these bases, his forces would launch brutal raids on surrounding villages, indiscriminately capturing men, women, and children. Those who survived the initial violence were often chained together and forced to march to the coast under horrific conditions. The brutality of these forced marches cannot be overstated. Many captives died along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or disease, their bodies left to rot by the roadside as a grim testament to the ruthlessness of Tippu Tip's regime. The treatment of those captured was unrelentingly harsh. Once enslaved, individuals were stripped of their humanity, reduced to nothing more than economic assets. Women were often sexually abused, both as a means of control and as a reward for Tippu Tip's men, while children were forcibly separated from their families and sold off in coastal markets. Those who were fit enough to survive the arduous journey to Zanzibar were then sold to Arab, Indian, or European buyers, destined for plantations or households across the Indian Ocean world. Many of the slaves captured by Tippu Tip ended up in Oman, Persia, and other regions, contributing to the expansion of slave-based economies beyond Africa. The sheer scale of Tippu Tip's slave trading empire was immense. At its peak, his operations accounted for the capture and sale of tens of thousands of Africans each year, contributing to the massive depopulation of Central Africa and the devastation of countless communities. His raids, which were often carried out with the assistance of local chiefs seeking favor or protection, were a constant source of terror for the people living under his shadow. Entire regions became depopulated as villages were destroyed, crops were burned, and people were either enslaved or forced to flee. The social fabric of Central Africa was irreparably torn apart by Tippu Tip's slave raids, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and displacement that would reverberate for generations. While the slave trade was the most visible and brutal aspect of Tippu Tip's empire, it was not his only source of wealth. The extraction of ivory from Central Africa was another key pillar of his economic power, and it too was marked by extreme violence and exploitation. Elephants, prized for their valuable tusks, became another target of Tippu Tip's relentless drive for profit. His forces would organize massive hunting expeditions, sometimes lasting months, to track down and kill as many elephants as possible. The scale of this ivory trade was staggering, with entire regions being stripped of their elephant populations to feed the insatiable demand for ivory in Europe and the Middle East. These hunting expeditions were often accompanied by forced labor and violence. Local populations were conscripted into service, either as porters to carry the heavy tusks back to coastal trading posts, or as hunters forced to track and kill elephants under the threat of violence. Refusal to cooperate with Tippu Tip's men was often met with brutal reprisals, including torture, execution, or enslavement. Villages that failed to meet ivory quotas were sometimes subjected to violent punishment, with entire communities being wiped out as an example to others. The environmental consequences of Tippu Tip's ivory trade were devastating. Vast swaths of Central Africa were depopulated of elephants, leading to a dramatic decline in the region's biodiversity. The destruction of the elephant populations also had cascading effects on the ecosystems of the Congo Basin, where elephants play a crucial role in maintaining the health of the forest. By decimating these populations, Tippu Tip not only contributed to the environmental degradation of Central Africa, but also undermined the traditional ways of life of the people who depended on the forest for their survival. As European powers began to take a greater interest in Central Africa, Tippu Tip's empire became increasingly entangled in the complex web of colonial politics. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which effectively carved up Africa among the European powers, marked a turning point in Tippu Tip's career. Although he had built his empire on violence and exploitation, Tippu Tip was a shrewd political operator who recognized the need to adapt to the changing geopolitical landscape. He understood that his continued dominance in the region would depend on his ability to navigate the growing influence of European colonialism. Tippu Tip's relationship with European colonial powers was marked by a mixture of cooperation and conflict. On one hand, he was willing to work with European explorers and traders, providing them with guides, porters, and information in exchange for access to European goods and military support. His cooperation with European explorers such as Henry Morton Stanley, who was tasked with exploring the Congo for King Leopold II of Belgium, helped to solidify Tippu Tip's influence in the region. Tippu Tip saw these alliances as a way to further his own ambitions and expand his control over Central Africa. However, Tippu Tip's relationship with Europeans was not without tension. As Belgium, Germany, and Britain sought to establish their own colonial footholds in the region, Tippu Tip found himself increasingly at odds with European interests. His empire, built on the exploitation of African labor and resources, was seen as a threat to European colonial ambitions, particularly in the Congo, where King Leopold II sought to establish total control over the region's ivory and rubber trade. As European colonial forces began to encroach on his territory, Tippu Tip was forced to engage in a delicate balancing act, using diplomacy and military force to protect his interests while avoiding direct confrontation with the vastly superior European powers. Despite his best efforts to maintain his autonomy, Tippu Tip's empire began to crumble under the weight of European colonialism. The introduction of European military technology, combined with the growing presence of European colonial administrators, made it increasingly difficult for Tippu Tip to maintain his control over Central Africa. His once powerful empire, built on the backs of enslaved Africans and the blood of elephants, began to unravel as European powers asserted their dominance over the region. The psychological and social impact of Tippu Tip's reign on Central Africa was profound. For those who lived under his rule, life was characterized by fear, violence, and dehumanization. The constant threat of slave raids and ivory hunts left entire populations living in a state of perpetual terror, with people abandoning their homes and livelihoods in a desperate attempt to escape Tippu Tip's reach. Villages were depopulated, families were torn apart, and traditional social structures were shattered as Tippu Tip's forces swept through the region, leaving destruction in their wake. The trauma experienced by those who were captured and sold into slavery was immense. For many, the experience of being torn from their families and forced into a life of servitude was a deeply dehumanizing ordeal. The brutal conditions under which slaves were transported, combined with the violence and abuse they endured at the hands of their captors, left deep psychological scars that would reverberate for generations. Many enslaved Africans died during the long and treacherous journey to the coast, while others succumbed to disease, starvation, or exhaustion. For those who survived, life as a slave was often marked by constant abuse, exploitation, and dehumanization. The legacy of Tippu Tip's reign extended far beyond the immediate impact of his slave raids and ivory hunts. The depopulation of vast regions of Central Africa, combined with the destruction of traditional social structures, left a lasting mark on the region's cultural and political landscape. Communities that had once been vibrant and self-sufficient were reduced to shadows of their former selves, struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of Tippu Tip's reign of terror. Tippu Tip's empire may have crumbled in the face of European colonialism, but the psychological scars of his brutal rule persisted long after his death. The trauma inflicted on Central Africa by Tippu Tip's slave trade and ivory hunts would continue to shape the region's history for generations to come, as the people of Central Africa struggled to rebuild their lives in the wake of one of the most brutal periods in their history.